Welcome to Medmarc's webinar series. Today's presentation is titled How Human Factors is a Key Component of Your Product Risk Management Process and Why Regulatory Agencies Are Paying Attention. I'm Kate Klaus, Senior Attorney in Medmarc's Risk Management Department. On behalf of Medmarc and today's presenter, Shannon Hoste, thank you for joining us. Shannon is the president of Agilis Consulting Group, an assistant professor in the Quality Science Education Program at Pathway for Patient Health, and is active on several standards and conference committees for medical devices and combination products. Formerly, Shannon worked as team lead for human factors in FDA's Center for Devices and Radiological Health, and as human factors reviewer within the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, Division of Medication Error Prevention and Analysis. At the FDA, she led reviews of human factors data for medical device pre-market submissions through 510K, PMA, and de novo pathways, as well as combination products through NDA, BLA, ANDA pathways, and data to support IND and IDE requests. Shannon has earned a BS in Mechanical Engineering from the University of Toledo, an MS in Management from Mount Vernon Nazarene University, and an MS in Cognitive Systems Engineering from The Ohio State University. And with that, I am pleased to turn things over to Shannon.
Excellent. Thank you, Kate. All right. So we're here today to talk about human factors. And so we're going to dive in. Happy to be here. And we're going to do a quick overview of human factors. And I know we may have folks in the audience who are newer to hearing this term and folks that have more experience with it. I actually recognize some of the names. So I know there's some folks out there with lots of experience in human factors, but we'll do a quick overview. And then we'll dive into what the regulatory bodies are looking for and how HF maps out within the development process. And then we'll have some time at the end for question and answer. I look forward to that. Okay, so step back. If you know a human factors person and you ask them how they came into the field of human factors, you're going to hear a winding path. You're going to hear a winding path, and you're going to hear a different journey for every person that's in it. It's actually quite interesting. But what it is it's a multidisciplinary practice. A lot of folks come in from more of the psychology, the human performance aspect. Other folks come in from the engineering aspect, and it's kind of a meet in the middle, right? Understanding all of the aspects. So I wanted to give you a quick story from my journey into human factors, and I'm doing this more so just to help you understand some of the connections between this discipline of human factors and medical device development. So my journey in med device development started in mid to late 90s, and I was working as a mechanical engineer in product development. And what I was seeing, some of my first projects were more on the sustaining engineering side. So it's products that were on market, and then as any issues were identified, doing some investigations to understand what was happening. What I was seeing was injection devices that were fracturing. And I was doing all of the mechanical engineering things. I was running the finite element analyses and doing all of the calculations, looking at the materials, couldn't understand why they were fracturing. So ran a scan on the surface and identified on several of the devices returned had lubricants on the devices. So in one case, it was motor oil. In another case, it was butter. And so what was happening was people, it wasn't so much that the force was too high, it's that it wasn't consistent. So it was going, there was a stick slip kind of feel to it. And so people were lubricating their devices, and plastics and oils, they don't get along too well. It embrittles the plastics and they fracture. Okay. So fast forward a little bit, and I'm working on other projects where I'm sitting down and trying to write product requirements and trying to start to build out my project management file, right? And my free body diagram mechanical engineering brain was a little bit stuck, because I was like, well, how do I understand what users could do, right? They could do anything. They can put butter in their device. They could do anything. And it was a little paralyzing of a realization, I think, for me. And the other challenge I had at the same time is the user needs, the needs statements that were coming in were largely coming in from a marketing perspective. And so working on a new device, and this device needs to be blue and it needs to be honest. Okay. So then same question. What does that mean? What does honest mean to a user, and what are they really looking for, and why do they need that? What do they truly need? So I started to explore this and try to better understand how to understand the users of the products that I was working on. And I was across the street from Ohio State, so I could walk over, started taking classes, and I knew first weekend of this class, that's what I was looking for, but it was the Cognitive Systems program there at Ohio State. And cognitive systems is a marriage of human performance, cognitive psychology, and systems engineering, interface design, and so forth. And what it presented to me was a systematic way to walk through and understand how people, humans, interact with technology, right? So then I could go forth and working on my product requirements, working on my risk management, use that lens to start to understand how do I turn those user needs into design inputs, and then also how do I start to identify what are the things that can happen in use that can lead to hazards in my risk management process as well. So for me, it was an epiphany. This was in the late 90s, as I mentioned. The interesting thing then is human factors has been around for decades as a practice, cognitive systems, but it's largely in safety critical system space. So nuclear, energy, defense, right? And it was just starting to come on the radar in healthcare and med device around the same time. And I'll jump through that. You'll see that in the IOM report that came out in 1999, which highlighted the medical error that was happening based on studies that were done in the 80s and the 90s, and how receiving healthcare based on this medication error was more dangerous, orders of magnitude more dangerous than, say, flying or driving, right? So it really opened up some eyes and made folks start thinking about this. And shortly thereafter, a recommendation paper came out. And so the report and the recommendations are speaking a lot about human factors systematic approach to thinking about these errors, and also made several recommendations for AHRQ, CDC, FDA, and the VA. And so on the medical device space, I'll just focus on this because those recommendations were for safety in healthcare, healthcare delivery, medication error, and then medical device safety. And so in the early 2000s, first decade of the 2000s, some guidance documents and publications were released from the FDA. But really the traction started happening in the industry, in the space, around 2011. And what happened then, again in the US here, is that a draft guidance was released from the FDA that kind of outlined what their expectations were around human factors. But also those folks within the FDA that would review this data moved into the pre-market divisions. So they were actually part of the reviews and could be reviewing that data to support understanding of use-related risk and safety. So, so that is as it's marching along. And then in late 2015, it was December, and early 2016, they were about 6 weeks apart, two documents got updated. One was the international standard 62366-1. What happened with this standard? There's a long history for that had been around and establishing kind of some of this international understanding around usability engineering. And in this move over to the 62366-1, it was purely focused in on safety, and a lot of the other information around general usability was pulled out into a -2 which is your informative. And so this is the normative standard that outlines a usability engineering process. And then shortly thereafter, the final FDA guidance document was released for CDRH, outlining the expectations around the human factors process for med devices and submissions. And also there was a draft at the same time around combination products as well. And subsequently on the FDA front, other guidance documents have been released. And what you're also seeing and starting in 2018, 2019 is other standards being released that refer back to 62366. So for an example is 11607, which is a packaging standard, has a requirement in it that refers back to 62366 as a method to evaluate usability for aseptic presentation. And also in 2019 with the 14971 update, that standard now also refers to 62366 with regards to a methodology for evaluating, the term is hazard related use scenarios, right? It's a term that's used in 62366 as well. Then we have, so the MDR went live this year, and while they're still working on harmonizations, that's all being worked out, but still the 62366 is the state of the art, the international standard that people are largely referring back to demonstrate that. But even within the EU MDR, within the annexes, you have the GSPRs, and within those there are specific callouts around considerations for usability, and even some specific considerations such as for packaging of sterile products, there is a need to ensure that the end user is capable of understanding, and it's an effective indication if their sterile product has been tampered with or sterile barrier breached. And then maybe next year, we'll see how it goes. IVDR will be coming live and has many of the same considerations with regards to usability. So the framework is in place around human factors and usability engineering. We've come a long way, actually, since 99, I think, in this space. And it's exciting to see as more of these get applied to a larger range of products. At the end of the day, the regulations are there because it's been shown to improve safety, right? So what we're seeing is that general improvement within medical device products and combination products due to an increased focus on the user. So it's all well and good, but what is human factors, right? I've thrown around the term usability engineering and human factors engineering both so far. And they're in this space, they're largely interchangeable. The international term is usability engineering. The term more used by the FDA in the US is the human factors engineering. But again, when we're talking about safety, in med device, particularly in combo products, they're largely interchangeable. So I'm going to be pulling definitions from the IEC 62366-1 standard. And so we're going to talk through those a little bit. So the definition of usability engineering, I'm going to read this, so bear with me, I won't read them all, but just this one. Application of knowledge about human behavior, abilities, limitations, and other characteristics to the design of medical devices. So I mentioned earlier the multidisciplinary nature of this field, and it's right here in the statement. So what you're looking at is understanding what are the physical interactions, the behavioral interactions, decision-making abilities, right, of the folks using products, and then also the design of those systems to interface with well. So again, it's that marriage between some of the human performance aspects and the technology aspect of design. And so all of this is to achieve adequate usability. Excuse me. So one thing I want to point out, and this is a note to this definition in the standard, is that achieving adequate usability can result in an acceptable risk related to use. So this is the key point to drive home, I think, is that in all of this discussion, what we're talking about is safety and risk. So again, as we're talking about usability, we're talking about it related back to the risk of your product. All right, so usability, what exactly do you mean by that? That's a very general term, which can cause some confusion. It's not necessarily ease of use, but what we're looking at here, the definition is characteristic of the user interface that facilitates use and establishes effectiveness, efficiency, and user satisfaction in the intended use environment. And again, with the note that this is either increasing or decreasing safety. So again, what we're looking at is the bottom line, essentially at the end of the day, that you're trying to show with all of this is that your user interface of your product supports safe and effective use, right? And so you see this in the definitions within the 62366 standard, and you see this within the definitions and discussion in the FDA guidance documents as well. And also this mention of user interface. So user interface as a term to many folks brings to mind more of like your GUI user interface, right? Your screen on your phone or your screen on your computer. But in this case, in this definition, and as well as the FDA's definitions in their guidance documents, a user interface is the entire product. So it's all of the means by which the user and the device interact. So this is not just my screen, but the weight of my phone, the size of my phone, the buttons, right? All of those features that I use to interact, but also the labeling and the packaging, right? All of those things that I need to navigate in order to use my product in a safe and effective manner. So this diagram here, and this really sums up, and this is what I was thinking of when I said a systematic way to think through use of a product. This is again a diagram from that standard, and it starts to map out the general concept of you have your user interface and you have your medical device and the user, and it's just you're expanding the system boundaries to include that user and thinking about the interactions that are happening. So, for example, your product is generating an output. That output is noticed and perceived by the user. They understand it and make a decision on it. And then they take an action. They either take an action on that system itself or on another system. Then the system processes that through. How that relates back to risk, we'll say, is when I'm taking this action or when the user is taking an action on either system, they could do what's called a use error, which is they do the wrong step, they skip a step, they do it at the wrong time, wrong amount, those kind of considerations. And so then when I'm taking action on something and it's in a use error, that could be creating or contributing to a hazardous situation. So means by which a hazard can be converted and becomes a harm. Or I can take an action on my system. So for example, think of say an ablation system. I'm going to, as a user, put in and program the energy amount I want delivered. If I made, say, an error in the mathematics of determining what level of energy I wanted, I may put in the wrong value here, and that input is processed and it outputs energy from my system, in which case that contributes to the hazard and hazardous situation associated with that energy. So, so this provides a framework to start to understand and break down the pieces of the user interaction story and understand what can contribute to those errors and then what could result from those errors. So again, all of this, the bottom line is you want to optimize your user interface to support safe and effective use. And the human factors process, the use-related risk analysis we'll talk about in a second, are methodologies to systematically walk through and do that throughout development. Okay, so how does this then translate into to a manufacturer? What do you do with this, right? So there's the quality management systems throughout the product lifecycle, your 21 CFR 820s and your ISO 13485s. And within those outline your general requirements, but then you have processes that navigate throughout that process. So there's the human factors document is in fact a process. A lot of times folks think of human factors as the validation test that happens at the end, but it is in fact an entire process, not too dissimilar in my opinion to the 62304 software development lifecycle process, which again is built throughout the process and is designed to build in safety. And then kind of the backbone to all of this is that risk management process from 14971 that's marching through the entire product lifecycle and kind of works as a good common point where all of this information can kind of filter in and be captured. So what I wanted to show, and this is from AMI TIR 59, it was released in 2017. And this was all about integrating human factors into design controls. And so this graph comes from that TIR, and it outlines different activities. These are all human factors related activities happening from pre-design control through market release. And you'll see these red boxes are all associated with risk management. And again, this risk management piece is the foundation of all of this work because it is a safety-based process. And so it's a matter of initially understanding your users, your use environments, your use scenarios. Then you can start mapping that to understand what are all of the tasks of use, and then start walking through in what's been coined a use-related risk analysis, walking through each task of use and start saying, okay, what could go wrong at this task? The user could do it at the wrong time, wrong place, right? And then understanding what the potential outcome could be from those. So for those in product development, this probably sounds pretty familiar. It's never been really a question of with design FMEAs or process FMEAs, right? So as you're working in a design FMEA, you're walking through each aspect of that design and thinking about what could go wrong. And it helps you explore your design and explore how to put controls in place to control risk. Same thing with a process FMEA, similar idea. So here I'm just walking through my steps of use and understanding what can go wrong and what's the outcome. Again, all of these are informed and can potentially cause and lead to hazards and things in your larger risk management file. So that risk assessment really drives all of the activities past all of this framework that I'm establishing about understanding my product and my users. Then as I'm assessing that risk, that drives the focus of my development activities, my formative testing, and eventually my summative testing as well. So you implement the process, you implement, you have your product development process. What data is necessary on the regulatory interaction side? So just to give a quick rundown of some of those things within the FDA, depending on what your product is, you're interacting with CDRH, CDR, or CBER. And so within each of those, whether it's 510K, PMA, or an NDA, you're running through a pre-market review of your data. And so if there are safety-related questions with regards to use, that's when that human factors data could be provided to support that. Now, there are some specific types of studies, types of data that are requested in some cases, and some of those would be like the generics for drug and biologics generics, the prescription to OTC. We've seen several presentations from the FDA over the last few years about what type of human factors data might be necessary around self-selection. And then there's also a paper out on emergency use authorization for COVID diagnostics, where they're looking for some specific testing. I think they call it a human usability test. It's a little bit different from the standpoint of what they're looking at, very specific information for very specific data. that relates to that, the diagnostics. So in some cases, there are some specific guidances, but by and large, it refers back to the FDA guidance. And then as these are built into your quality management system, right, then it falls into that audit category and inspection category. And then what you see from notified bodies, you have the conformity assessments, and only to the standard, but also to the GSPRs, right? So right now you're doing the conformity assessment to the GSPRs. You could be referencing a process that you did to 62366 as state of the art, but there's still some specific elements within those GSPRs you're going to have to show data for, such as the example I gave you about the tamper evidence in a sterile product. And so you'll need to make sure that data is captured. So it's just making sure that all of that information is built into your risk management process and your human factors process as necessary to make sure that you're exploring the right things. And then when is data requested? Because I'm sure if you've been in med device for any length of time and have done submissions, sometimes it's requested, sometimes it's not. And that question is based on that use-related risk that we discussed. And so I just want to show you a few terms coming out of the guidance document. Excuse me. So this is a busy slide, stick with me. CDRH. So this is out of the 2016 guidance, indicating that analysis of risk of users performing tasks incorrectly or failing to perform tasks, use error, could result in serious harm. Manufacturers should submit human factors data in pre-market submissions. Okay, one thing to highlight is this phrase here. It says could result in serious harm. It doesn't say could result in unacceptable risk, right? It says serious harm. So risk is the severity of harm times the probability of that harm. This is just talking about the severity of harm. Why is that? Okay, this goes back to that safety critical systems perspective. If there is something in that user interface that could lead to a use error, or information isn't presented where it's necessary or it isn't conveyed to the user, then that is always there. And you see this also discussed in annexes to 14971 as well, around usability in software. And same issue is if a software anomaly is there that could lead to harm, it's always there. It's whether or not it's triggered. Same thing on the case of a user interface element that could lead to a use error. So the idea is you go through, you identify, and then you highlight those items that can lead to serious harm and then focus in on those. And that's what really scopes that human factors activity. This is from the combination product guidance, the draft that was released in 2016 as well. And so this is for combination products, and there's several, there's lots in both of these guidance documents. I'm just grabbing a few things out of it to drive home a point. But it identifies to ensure use-related hazards associated with a product are eliminated or mitigated to reduce patient adverse events and medication errors attributable to use-related errors. So again, this is by and large, you're thinking about a different type of product, right? You have the medical device where you're assessing risk and potential use-related risk associated with the purpose of that medical product. In a drug delivery product, your purpose is to deliver a drug. And so medication errors is, your kind of your top line consideration, right? That's what's establishing your effectiveness. And so as you're thinking about use-related hazards that they use in this term, but both these documents refer to critical tasks as being those tasks that can lead to serious harm in the case of CDRH, harm in the case of the combination product guidance that can lead to medication errors. And then in the same vein, 62366 refers to hazard-related use scenarios is the term. This is very similar to the concept of a critical task. And it identifies that once you get to your summative or your validation evaluation, you're looking at all hazard-related use scenarios or a subset based on the severity of the potential harm. So again, all of these are focused in on what are those elements, even though you may project that it's a low probability of occurrence, but if it could lead to a catastrophic event, you'll want to explore it, right? So it's that lens. So how has this been playing out? Because I talked about these all coming out in 2016. That was 5 years ago, almost 6 years ago at this point. So how's this been looking? So this is a slide from the FDA, was shared at a webinar in 2020. And this is from CDRH. And it talks about the URRA, that's an acronym largely coined by the FDA, the use-related risk assessment. And the discussion about how that impacts clearance or approval. And so what we're seeing here is 2019 data, is that the HF team in CDRH looked at 542 HF engineering reviews. So what happens is a file comes in for pre-market review or pre-sub, and then that HF portion of that file goes over to the human factors team in CDRH by and large, and they review the data. And what they were seeing is the red here is the HF reviews by submission type. So your de novo, IDE, HDE. ICC is inter-center consult. So this would be likely combination products, not like your auto injectors. Those typically are reviewed by DMEPA and CDER, but your other combination products. And 510Ks, PMAs, and Q-subs, which is your pre-submissions. And what they were seeing in the teal, those are the files that went through with no further interactions or deficiencies. So in 2019, a large majority of these had some level of interaction after they were first reviewed. And so they went through and identified kind of what were the contributing factors to those, and found by and large, the largest contributor is the use-related risk assessment. Now, based on what I was saying earlier, hopefully this makes sense, because the use-related risk assessment is really the foundation for what is being evaluated afterwards, right? So if I do a validation study based on a use-related risk assessment, but my use-related risk assessment is incomplete, maybe I missed a use scenario, maybe I didn't consider a user group, right? Then that study is not complete. So, so until that URA is appropriately established, it's not clear that the validation study is appropriately scoped, right? All right. So what's that mean? Here's what that means. That means a delay. Excuse me. Imagine you're coming into for a 510K and you're submitting, and let's say you submitted HF data, but it was based on an incomplete URA. If you need to submit more data, human factors data from a supplemental validation study, for example, and in this example, you'd have to go back, update your URA, and then run the study. You're talking a minimum 4 to 6 months delay, right, to get all of that done, because of the time involved in recruiting and doing all of these studies. That's not good. Not good in a 510K or any regulatory submission for that matter. So, pardon me. Just a moment. So this takes us back to making sure that you're capturing and building that information as you go, and establishing your human factors process within your product development process. So I wanted to make a quick note on, I won't go through this, but it's here if you want to see it. The data output from human factors studies. So we talked about, you establish your foundation, understanding your users and use environment and use scenarios. You do your use-related risk assessment. You understand where, what hazard-related use scenarios you have. I'll use that term from the standard. And you evaluate those based on severity. So your output from the studies, particularly the late-stage formatives and your summatives, is you are putting that user in a representative use scenario, and you're monitoring how they're interacting with the device and confirming that the design elements that you put in place to that user interface are effective. And so when you get to your summative validation study, it's essentially, another way to think of it is a kind of a dry run of your post-market, right? So you're trying to build that representative scenario of the use environment that your product will be used in once it's out on the market, and bringing in 15 users per user group and having them use your product. And what you're doing is you're watching them, you're capturing observation data, and you're capturing subjective data, which is what their feedback is. So you're watching for difficulties, for use errors, so that they're using the product effectively. But you're also then taking data back from them, because they may say, oh, I almost did this instead of that, right? And so maybe it was something you couldn't observe. And then you're also collecting their feedback to better understand why they did what they did. All of this data comes together. And essentially, again, if you're familiar with software development, this should sound familiar to how you deal with anomalies in the disposition process. But you take the potentials for use there that you identified in that study, and you assess them all. You root cause them, and you understand what could result from that, and if any further design improvements or mitigations are necessary. All right. So the outcome from that study is not a pass-fail. The outcome from that study is a risk assessment, essentially, of understanding what was observed in that study and why you do or don't need to do anything about it. Right. And establishing that, okay, great, we did this assessment, and just like you would with a risk management file, it actually feeds into your risk management file. At the end of the day, this, in conjunction with all of my other risk information, supports that my product supports safe and effective use. So I know, coming from a quality background, a verification heavy background, sometimes that's difficult, because in verification studies, you're very used to running statistical levels of evaluation, or again, process and accept on 7, reject on 8, the very numeric pass-fail type criteria. This is not that. This is an in-depth, deliberate, risk-focused analysis. And again, it comes right back to this type of diagram. What use errors did we see? What hazardous situations and potential harms could result from that? And are they reduced as far as possible, or do I need to do anything else? Or, tying back to your larger risk management file, are there other mitigations in place that can intervene between that hazardous situation and your harm, right? So that is what the output of those studies are. And then that data is what you're providing then for your review in a regulatory perspective. Yep. So end of the day, your goal from all of that is you're reviewing all of that data and compiling that data. You're doing it to support an argument that you have optimized the user interface to ensure safe and effective use. So it's all supporting that. It's the output of your human factors process and your human factors validation studies. So activities need to start in concept development and progress. Again, they inform and are informed by the risk management process throughout software development lifecycle process as well, and your product development process. So you're, again, generating design inputs out of your risk controls that you're identifying, at the various levels of your activities. Your use-related risk assessment provides the focus for the development activities around your user interface, and it also then provides a framework to manage post-market surveillance issues. So a lot of post-market data you can get back. Having the use-related framework in place, you can start to understand as some of those issues are coming back and tie them to issues with your user interface. It generates the data to support your submissions, and it improves your product and your user's experience with that product. So there's value in this beyond just the regulatory requirement. And I think in my experience, folks have gotten into human factors based on the regulatory requirements because they have to, they're being asked for the data. But then you quickly see, as you start to look in and you sit through your first usability study, where you're watching someone interact with your product, and you learn so much, and you start to see the value in generating that data and then using it to inform your process. And the bottom line that I want to leave you with is kind of the reality of the situation. And that is that a human factors usability assessment will be done on your product. The decision is whether you're doing it during development or whether it's being done by your users once you're on the market. It's just kind of the reality of the work. And so generating as much as you can internally, designing those big things out, particularly the big things that can lead to safety issues, is only going to serve you and your customers and the public health, which is why regulatory cares as well. So with that, I can open it up to questions.
Thanks very much, Shannon. We do have a few questions for you from our listeners. First, we've had some questions about current regulatory trends. Could you talk about any particular aspects of human factors engineering that FDA is focusing its scrutiny on?
I think so. I think a lot of it ties back to that use-related risk assessment. So not necessarily, I mean, obviously, if there are issues with a particular class of product, that may be catching more interest. In the past, in the early 90s, there was a lot of issues being seen on infusion pumps. And then more recently, defibrillators in the early 2000s. And then again, more recently would be the reprocessing on the duodenoscopes. So as things are identified in the market, particularly on classes of products, that can draw attention. When it's in all of those three cases, there were use-related issues with those that were contributing to the problems. But by and large, it drives back to that risk-based assessment and understanding when there is potential for high severity harm with regards to the use of the product. So you can see it in different cases. You see it coming up in AI and the aspect of that, the user understanding, the transparency of the AI. When do they need to intervene? What decisions are going into that? And when can they trust it? When can't they trust it? And a lot of those questions that are coming up there come right back to this same, and this discipline, you see it's applied in aerospace, and you see it a lot in the discussions around, self-driving vehicles and things like that automation factor. So it'll be interesting to see as, particularly as technology evolves, how we can keep up and make sure that we're ensuring that people can effectively use that technology.
Would you say this is similar to or different from other regulatory bodies around the world?
So the FDA's perspective on it, I think, is where that's going. Well, I think so. So by and large, up until MDR, by and large, the 62366 standard it follows the same premise, the same. It's a process for these activities. There are a few separate specific data sets they're looking for in that standard. And some of the terminology is a little different, but by and large, it's similar. And so if you were satisfying the FDA requirements and satisfying some of those things in 62366, that created a body of evidence that supported your product in many areas. With MDR, I'm seeing a much more focused look, particularly in the GSPR list when you run through that, a much more focused look on human factors or usability in that case. And so I'm curious to see how it plays out now that it's live. We're starting to see some reviews go through with the notified bodies and how they're reviewing that human factors data as well. But by and large, it's an international standard. So that is, from my experience, been kind of the de facto in different regions.
Great. We do have a couple of questions about studies themselves. First, how can someone best leverage data obtained from studies conducted outside of the US to support an FDA submission?
Yeah, that's a tough one for usability. So the challenge there is one, the FDA flat out in the guidance asks for U.S. data. That's the populace they're in charge of, protecting the public health for, and they're looking to make sure, because as you're testing user groups, are there any differences between those user groups in different countries that could affect performance with the device, for example? So it's often you need US-based data to support, if you need human factors data, you need that to support your submission. There are some cases that I've seen where it's maybe a surgical device with, specially trained surgeons, and so you can make the case that a surgeon in Germany is trained equivalently to a surgeon in the US, and make those user group comparisons, but you would need to go through and make that, why is this data relevant to the US kind of justification. So it's by and large, from what I've seen, it's usually pointing back to collecting data in the US.
Okay. How many subjects are typically recommended for a usability study?
Yeah, so the FDA put a number down that came out in the 2011 draft guidance. That's 15 per user group. And again, because of this type of research, it's largely qualitative research, not quantitative research. So that number is based on kind of the qualitative research methods, and particularly in usability, what happens in practice is you start seeing very similar issues after so many folks, right? And so that 15 number, they reference back to a study. It's in the guidance document, but the 15 number is the line drawn in the sand per user group. So what that means is, for example, if I have a device that's used from ages 2 to 70, I might have 2 user groups. I might have 3 user groups just based on age, because I might have the children, the pediatrics, but I might also have a separate group for adolescents who would self-administer, and then a third group for adults, because there are potentially in that use of that product, let's say I'm thinking of RA, so something a patient might have for their entire life. If they have it when they're younger, as they get to that adolescent age, they start to self-administer and self-care. And so, but they're still pediatrics, they're still adolescents, right? So understanding that user group can be important as well. So it's a matter of understanding how your product is used, and then breaking it down and understanding what are the distinct characteristics between the user groups of your product, and who do you need to evaluate to support your user interface.
And we have 2 questions that are somewhat similar. So one asks whether there can be any overlap between clinical trials and usability testing. And the other asks, how do you know when to seek IRB approval for a human factors study?
Okay. Yeah, I'll go with the clinical trial first. So with the clinical trial, the challenge there is clinical trials are very controlled, right? Because of what you're trying to understand and what you're driving there. So if you're trying to get usability information or human factors information in a clinical trial, the question is, are they using it in a representative manner? So do they have potentially more information than your users in the market might have? Do they have more guidance, more tracking, more interactions with the clinicians, things like that could affect use, right? And so the question is, as you're trying to collect that data, can you effectively get representative data out of that clinical study? I've seen clinical studies more often be helpful for more formative type data, right? You can get feedback from users and incorporate that, make sure you're accounting for that in your risk analysis and such. But it's difficult from the standpoint of, one, again, representativeness, and two, also, again, with usability, you need to collect objective and subjective data. So I need to be able to see what they're doing and capture information on how they're using the product, and then also have that interaction with them to get their self-reported feedback as well. And sometimes that can be difficult in a clinical study as well. So typically the advice is to run them as separate studies. And in the case of what order to do that in, your human factors study, one can establish that your device would be safe for a clinical study, if that's a question. So it can be safety data to support a clinical. But also, if if you run a human factors study and then a clinical changes something and you have to rerun human factors, that's a little bit of time and money. But if you do it the other way around and you run clinical and then change something in human factors and have to rerun your clinical, that's an order of magnitude, right? Change over a human factor study. So just some business and safety considerations in those.
Does
an IRB.
Oh, sorry.
In an NCIRB question, because there's there's a lot of discussion around it, around the IRB question, and I'll give you my opinion on it. So when you look in so within say CDER, so in the US, and you look where human factors data goes into your submission file, and it goes into a folder called other clinical studies, right? And so it tends to fall into that same kind of, it's safety data. Pardon me. And so it becomes a little more clear than in that case, that it would lead to an IRB. Also, a lot of the folks working in that space are used to doing that with clinical studies and such. On the med device side, a lot of it's being driven through verification testing and bench testing. And so human factors can sometimes look more like, in perception, they're trying to look at it more like a validation study where you're swapping out the operators, right? But at the end of the day, you are collecting safety data, especially in a summative, but even in the formatives, you're informing that you're collecting safety data and you're using human subjects. So my advice is always to just go to and do the IRB review of your protocols. And I think that's the safest way to go. You also can sometimes get good feedback, even on like your screener, if you might be screening for things that can be sensitive, even gender type questions and such. But also it's now, this may not have been true 20 years ago, but now there are several IRBs that are familiar with the concept and what's being done in human factors testing. And so you can usually get a pretty quick turn. I mean, an IRB can take 2 to 7 days. So it's in that, it's pretty quick turn. So my advice is always to go ahead and consider implementing an IRB review.
Great. Does FDA have a preferred task analysis method to be used for the URRA?
Yeah, that's a good question. They don't, I know in my experience, and that's all I can really talk to, is you see a lot of different things come in, right? Just like the terms, summative testing versus validation testing versus human factors versus usability. So at the end of the day, you're looking at the data. So they're however that's presented. But I do think there are some examples in guidance. Also, if you go into within the recently approved drugs and combination products, and you can review the approval packages, and I get to it through drugs at FDA. You can look in, it's usually in the other file, where they have all of the other studies and data. You'll see the reviews of the human factors data in those combination products, if it's there. And those tend to follow a very consistent format, and there's a table there of how that final data is analyzed. I always think that's a good frame of reference in understanding how that data is visualized by reviewers, at least in the combination product space.
Great. Well, I think that will do it for our Q&A segment. Shannon, thanks very much for your time today. This is a timely and important topic, and I know your presentation will be valuable to our audience.
Awesome. Thank you. And if you need anything or have any follow-up questions, let me know.
Great. Thank you for joining us. This concludes today's webinar.